now, preparing for ministry, or how you forecast it, of having some kind of application to your ministry. For example, the model that I had drawn earlier about the church sect movement. What we were trying to show there was that there is a definite model that one can apply to churches. So that would be an application. We could take a theory and apply it. Same way we can take an event and apply it to our own life. What have we learned from this? It's a little bit like reflecting on biblical passages and making application to our own life spiritually. So the idea of taking historical event, what does this mean to me? Does it have relevance to me? And how might it apply to my own life? I think that's the best way to really gain from history. It's one thing to remember that we had the Council of Nicaea work on the books of the New Testament and cement that together in the year 397, but what does that have to do with you, 397? Very little. The New Testament canon, that has something to do with your belief system. But what does, say, Martin Luther's willingness to go out on a limb, to risk his reputation, risk his life, to stand against the Catholic Church, and the very good chance that he was going to die. I mean, it was probably a 90% chance he was going to die if he took that stand. And he took the stand, realizing that he could very well die for his beliefs. What does it mean to you or to me to take a stand on our beliefs? So this is the application, reflection and application ideas coming out of history. Now, certainly history has its limitations. There's no question about it. I mean, we can be idealistic concerning history. I've had people be idealistic about biblical passages, take them right out of context, throw them right into their life, say, this is for me. Gotten into big trouble doing that. I had this one dear friend who was a pastor many years ago, and we were being challenged in the district assembly to win so many people that year to the Lord and bring them into membership. And so fellas that were older were very conservative. They were talking about, well, we'll win 5, or we'll win 3, or we'll win 10. Well, my dear friend, Reverend Copsey, got up and said, I'm going to win 500 for the Lord this year. He got all excited and made that pledge. District superintendent discounted that pledge, obviously, in the count of numbers. The next year when he came back, Reverend Copsey got up and said, well, I don't know how many we won to the Lord this year, but we were out there working. Well, you see, here we have a person that just took an idealistic idea that the Lord was going to help him make this fantastic number. He didn't plan, he didn't have any way of getting to his goal, and he failed. And he had to stand up before everybody and admit that he failed and be embarrassed about it. And that's the way it is with history. Sometimes we can take historical facts that seem to create impossible idealistic and idealisms, and then we try to take them out and apply them to our life. Well, that's a limit to history. History can't do that for you. Second thing history cannot do for you is what we call taking certain principles selectively. We'll pull this out that seems to apply to me and use it. And being very selective about what we use. Again, it's almost the way of falsifying records. If I only do the easy things, that works. I can't face the hard facts, then I don't want to try it. Selective, being principle selective. And then there are certainly what we would call the general, that was the limitations, a couple limitations to history. And there are things we call like aspects of history. For example, we have what we call general history, which is a broad sweep. Doesn't delve into details. Our course is, in a sense, this broad sweep. It is general history. We're going to leave out so many details. And you will read more details than I will cover in class, because I cannot possibly cover all the details that you're going to do in the reading. So I depend upon you to fill in the gaps with your reading. Now, if you want to get more specific later on, and you liked your history and you want to do more in history, then you can certainly specialize and go into history at a deeper level. For example, in my PhD program, I studied in the area of American church history. And if you want to hear about my PhD dissertation, it's in a very narrow slice of history that supposedly goes deep. There's an old saying out there that as you get deeper and deeper in your subject and you get finer and finer in its definition, and you know more and more about less and less, it gets to a point where you know everything about nothing. And so it is in general history, a broad sweep. And then you can specialize as you please to. So we're looking at general history. Another aspect of history is that as we study it, we're seeing it through the eyes of faith. We are taking on a particular approach to history. We're seeing the actions and the works of the church. We're looking at what we might better call confessional history. We're trying to define it down in a way that we're looking at how the church was constantly being revived, how the church was constantly surveying itself and trying to improve itself. A type of confessional history, looking at history through the eyes of faith. And one of the things that you will discover, another aspect of history, is that history is very human because it's made up of human events. It's people telling stories. It's people having their encounter with God, encounter with one another, encounter with authorities, being moved by the Spirit to take a particular position, to move out and to accomplish something. So it is a human institution. And then finally, history for us, quite frankly, is a bridge. It's a bridge for us to connect with our past, to understand our roots. Something very important about understanding your roots and where you came from. I, this past summer, read for the first time Alex Haley's Roots. Enormous volume. But suddenly I began to feel what was being felt back in the 70s and 80s when this book was on one of the bestsellers lists. And you begin to read about the real lives of a person by the name of Kizzy, who was raped by her master, her white overseer, and she had a child, a biracial child. That biracial child grew up to be Chicken George. He got that name because he helped the master raise fighting chickens, and he became a very good young man at learning the ways of chickens. And eventually, Chicken George was able to liberate his family. And Alex Haley followed that family along till they're moving away to Tennessee, and as it eventually got to him, he went back to Africa to find the very first man that was captured and the family and tribe from where that capture happened, so he could connect with his African roots. Wonderful story. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to do so. But how does Christian history help us? We can read the Bible and learn about Jesus, the book of Acts, and learn about the first church as it began to start. But what about us, 2,000 years removed? Now please don't ever go out here and say, I'm going to start or I'm going to try to create a New Testament church. Forget it. You can't do it. We are so far removed from that culture that it would be impossible to replicate that. We are not living in their times. We're not living in their conditions. We don't know what it means to be under the foot of a very imperialistic, overbearing, powerful, warlike government in the Roman army and the Roman government. We don't know what it means to be persecuted by the very people from which we are trying to draw our membership. the Jews. We're so close to the Jewish heritage that we're all Jews ourselves. Now how can we, in that first century situation, understand today in the 21st century how they felt, how they acted, how they thought, how they responded to the truth in a very primitive situation at the beginning of the church? We have layers and layers and layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of culture and history and interpretation that comes on top of the biblical interpretation that we read today. We read it through our own lens of an American church. And whether we're in Pennsylvania or we're in Kentucky or we're in the deep south, say Alabama, or we're in Ohio or we're in Michigan, we're reading it through our regional eyes. We're reading it from our family background and understanding. We're reading it from the teaching that came from our preachers that we grew up under, our grandmothers that taught us at their knee, our mothers and fathers' interpretations and practices in their home. We're influenced by so many cultural inputs that it's impossible to us to go back. So what do? We have a bridge that connects us to the ideas and spirit of that age, and we can cross over back and forth on that bridge.
Amen.
Not replicating, but pulling from the ideas of the past and bringing them down into our own culture, our own age, our own situation, and quite frankly allowing the Spirit to interpret them through the spectacles that we look at when we read the Bible and understand the church. The best we can do is replicate the Spirit. That's the best we can do. And so there are aspects of history as we begin to understand it. Well, let's move on. You can move your slide forward. Because now as we begin to try to understand history, as we're going to be looking at, giving you a little background on it and giving you some theories to look at, now what we're going to do is try to understand what it means for our study. We're studying what's known as salvation history. I've used the word before here, the idea of confessional history, salvation history, as opposed to world history. Yes, the world's engaged in some of the facts and things that we're going to be talking about because we cannot divorce ourselves and isolate ourselves from the world. I already talked about that in this idea of the model of the merging. How far into the world will we go? Well, we'll see various levels of merger with the world as we study church history. And at times it'll get pretty intense. And then there will be those who feel that they have to back off and get out of Dodge, so to speak, because they can no longer take the involvement of the church in the world. And so we'll come and go at intensity levels. But this is salvation history. Now, while the world is concerned with men and events and secular realm of kings and governments and wars and migrations of people and economics, salvation history concerns itself with the progress and the development of the Church of Jesus Christ. It's the record of God's acts in history. And you can underscore God's acts because that's what it is. That's what the Bible is. It's a record of God's acts. And church history is the record of God's acts in an extended period of time beyond the book of Acts and the book of Revelation to the current day. And so the record of God's acts in history will record events that are both good and bad. They're going to make some of the things that happened in the name of the church, in the name of Christ, going to make you scratch your head. And you're going to ask yourself the question, how in the world had that anything to do with Jesus and the gospel? And rightly so, you can respond by saying, nothing.
Amen.
There's not a thing about that had anything to do with the gospel. And that's some of the dark days of the church. But then you will have some of those great things of revival that will sweep through people's lives and across frontiers and into missionary sacrifices that are made in places around the world and in strange and exotic areas. And you'll say, wow, that had to be Jesus at work. And as in world history, we're going to be dealing with personalities. We're going to be dealing with doctrinal issues. We will be dealing with ecclesiasticism as the church begins to develop. We'll deal with holy wars, so-called. We'll deal with pogroms and persecutions and inquisitions. But we'll deal with revivals as well. So it's into this world that Christ was born. And if you want to flip to the next page now, if you're there, we're dealing with the intertestamental period of the church. There are different phases of the development of the church. The first and earliest phase certainly was the book of Acts. And if you recall, as the book of Acts closes, Paul is still en route somewhere. He is finishing up his third missionary journey, and some speculate that he eventually got to Spain and he finished a fourth missionary journey. But we're seeing the majority of the book is really, the New Testament is really about Paul. And Paul's journeys, and Paul taking the gospel and writing his letters to these sites that he had visited. But there is a lot more going on. So in the intertestamental period, we have the influence of the Greeks who rule Palestine, but at the same time that influence of the Greeks continue to carry on, so that the world of Paul and the world of the Roman Empire was still a world of the Greeks. The Greek culture, the Greek language, Greek philosophy was still penetrating this world. And so the world of the New Testament and the world of the early church was still a Greek-influenced world. It was being influenced by Greek polytheism. You had many gods that were being worshipped, gods that were vengeful, gods that were adulterous, gods that were constantly requiring something of their followers, almost like ancient cults or early primitive cults of ancestral worship. If you did something wrong, the gods would do something to you. Then you had to do something to make it right. Make some kind of oblation or some kind of offering to try to set things right. There was a lot of superstition, a lot of fear that were controlling people at that time. And so you had not only the influences of the Greek religion, but you also had the influences of Greek philosophy. Things like Platonic or Platonism. I can't even say it, sorry. Platonism. The ideas that Plato put out, particularly in his Republic, the idea that we are really looking at false images. What we're looking at is not the real image of things. The idea that what we see is just temporal or is not the real thing is similar ideas that were found in Buddhism. That somehow we have to get beyond the facade of what we see to the reality beyond. Plato wrote about it in the Republic when he talked about these men. He gave the illustration. These men were chained to a rock and they could only look one direction. And behind them was a fire, and between them and the fire were these images that were being cast on the wall in front of these men chained to this rock. And all they could see were these shadows moving on the rock in front of them. And one day somebody came in and released one of these men and took them out into the light outside of this cave and showed them the realities of the world outside. And then they brought them back in and chained them back to the rock again. And the man that had been taken outside to see the realities of things outside began to tell his friends, wow, there is a whole world out there that we don't know about. And I just got to see. And then suddenly he's being ridiculed by everyone around him who said, well, that's not so. This is what's real. And they point to the shadows. This is real. What you saw wasn't real at all. And so Plato talking about the realities of another life. Certainly, later Christianity begins to borrow from the ideas of Plato, and Christianity is being affected by Platonic ideas and later Aristotelian ideas. And so you have things like Stoicism or Epicureanism or Aristotelianism that begins to bring its influence upon the world, and in some measures, certain sects of Christians. And then you have the mystery religions. Now, those of you out there in video land, if you want to go to the website there and pull up mystery religions, I'm going to talk about that for a minute. So I'm going over to change my screen. There were many religions that were involved, that were practicing during the time of the rise of Christianity. Christians wasn't the only new religion on the block at this time in history. I want to take you back and show you some examples of some Roman religious practices. And I'm going to give you examples of at least 3 forms of Roman worship and Roman gods that were worshipped. Saturn was one of the major gods that was worshipped by the Romans. And in this particular celebration, between the time of December 17th and 25th, you had the great festival to honor Saturn. Now, according to their ancient history, he was a prehistoric king, and he evidently had taught his ancestors about agricultural principles, civilization, and peace. He may have been a real king at some point. And what we have here are people that now began to focus upon him as a god. And so his celebration occurred during these days in December. Now, during this particular period of time, it's interesting, the practices that went on. It was a time of peace. Now, I want you to think of it because we have Christmas that we celebrate during this time, and the similarities here of this particular religion and our practices of Christmas. So during this time, we have peace. They dispensed of all punishment of criminals. The courts were closed. Any kind of warring was rested for this week. If the Roman armies were out there, they quit fighting for a week. Schools were closed, business was closed, even government offices were closed during this celebration. And during the month of December then, the greatest part, and this is a quote actually, come from Seneca the Younger. He said, "It is now the month of December when the greatest part of the city is in a bustle. Loose reins are given to the public dispensation. Everywhere you may hear the sound of great preparations, as if there were some real difference between the days devoted to Saturn and those for transacting business." Silver bells, silver bells, silver bells. So you begin to see some patterns here, but this is one example of what the Christians were facing. The wine god Bacchus was also, they had a festival for him during this time, so this is their overlapping of these particular festivals. Bacchus was the counterpart of the Greek Dionysus, these were the gods of wine. And in his case, he was also the god of mystery. Sometimes the gods, over time, develop different reputations, more than one reputation. Or one, attribute over another, a couple attributes. He was associated with the pre-Julian calendar in terms of the winter solstice of December 25th. After we changed the Julian calendar, we became then, the 21st became our solstice. It was on this date that the wine was now ready. It had been fermenting, and it was now ready, and it was poured out into jars then for drinking. So you have this drunken orgies that are starting to occur during this time with the celebration of Bacchus. It was during this time, and this is one of the mystery religions, Mythos. his birthday, the holy day around him was December 24th, and we were honoring him for his birthday at this particular time. He was the God of light and truth. Does that mean anything to you? Did you hear that?
That sounds familiar.
Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Who was believed to be responsible for vanquishing winter, because the winter solstice had now occurred and daylight starts getting longer at this point. So he is kind of the inspiration for the return of spring. And one of the things you have in many of these gods that kind of revolve around the seasons of the year, and there's a lot of emphasis upon the coming of spring and turning from the winter solstice to the coming to winter solstice and then moving forward. So there is an act of dying, death, and resurrection. And so this is an example of the idea of resurrection that was coming around Mythos. And then you had the unconquered sun, Sol Invicta, which was now, his festival was on December 25th. So now we have the third god that was in this, that's being celebrated in this same area. The festival of Sol. Here was the god of the sun, and here they are proclaiming his dominance, not only in the sky, but the power of the sun in the idea of reclaiming, coming back into full life. So he was diminishing in his power, and a type of death occurs, and then his powers of resurrection occur as light begins to lengthen the days, and the sun begins to come back to its full power in the spring and the summer. So you have, again, this idea of death and dying, and that comes around the gods, again, centering upon the cycles of the sun. This was one of the dominant cults during the Christian era. It was found among the Roman elite, and Christians had to face this during their days of eventually coming into power. December 25th was declared Christ's birthday, not until 326. And it was done because of all of these Roman holidays and holy days that were celebrated at this particular time. Now, we will learn in our church history that Constantine moved the Christian religion from an outcast, persecuted body of people to the religion of the empire. And it started with the Act of Toleration, sometimes called the Edict of Milan in 311. And then you have another edict in 324, which now allows the Christian religion to practice freely throughout the empire and declared a legal religion. Soon after this, Constantine wants to make it the religion of the Roman Empire, and as it's moving more and more to merge with the Roman Empire, you begin to see major holy days being established to circumvent the old pagan holy days, because paganism was outruled as Christianity was inruled, if you please. So as Christianity was made legal, pagan religion then was outlawed. And so with this date adopted in 336, you're taking on now these other holy days that have been established. So there's a very strong tradition, not in the actual birth of Jesus, but in the reasons for establishing this date of December 25th as his birthday. But this gives you an example of some of the things that early Christianity was faced with. And we're talking a very popular religion. These are popular religions. Most of the people of the Roman Empire followed these religions. Let me ask you a question here. Do you see can we draw some kind of illustration from this in terms of today? What is it that we as Christians are facing today in terms of popular ideas and thought?
Obviously, other religions, removal of religion altogether, atheism, Scientology, different things, you name it, everything basically.
What's really popular right now?
I was going to take a different approach and
Go
say
ahead.
materialism is almost doing to Christianity what Christianity did to the Greek holidays of this era. Meaning they're pile driving onto Christian holidays and making them something they're not.
Easter Bunny.
And being in the retail business, I feel
Claus.
I have a right to talk about it that way because it's true. And the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus. I mean,
On
over
St.
and over again.
Patrick's Day, though, it's about wearing green and drinking beer. There's no
Right.
reference
There's
to
no
the great
reference
word.
to Saint-
On Valentine's Day, it's about Cupid and chocolates,
Right.
and that's not what Valentine was about.
And that's because they've successfully stolen those away from the church. They've
Yeah.
successfully co-opted those to where people don't even realize
The
that
true
at one
meaning.
point there was a true church meaning to those holidays. And my fear is that 50 years from now they're going to have done the same thing to Christmas. And
Well, it's
Easter
almost
is
there
right
now.
behind. I mean, yeah, it's
You can't
getting
put
really
up
bad.
you can't put up nativity scenes in any public place anymore.
right.
Any ideas out there?
I think churches are much more easily as denominations accepting those things that, or compromising on those things that the Bible calls sin, and accepting them as not sin, but just making that compromise.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of piggybacking off the consumeristic idea that we were talking about, I feel like the church feeds into that so much, though.
True.
The whole entire worship setup, or like the worship service, I feel like is becoming more and more consumeristic. We have to get really good bands that can sing well, so that the people like the music. We gotta get a dynamic preacher in there so people don't leave. So like I feel like Christians are feeding into the consumerism rather than, I guess, counter-reacting it.
Amen.
All right, let me ask you this question then. Has Joel Osteen helped or hurt us?
Well, with Joel, I would think that it's more about his message than anything else. Because I don't really consider Joel a dynamic preacher. I consider Joel more of a prosperity preacher, where you follow God, God will bless you. So I think it's more of his message, and his message is very consumeristic.
Mm-hmm.
Follow God, get great things. And I think unfortunately that has hurt the church. My question is, we talk about our services being so consumeristic, but what can the church do to not be consumeristic?
Yeah.
I mean, if you bring in a very stoic, plain preacher, why am I going to want to come? I mean, it's almost like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because if you don't have things that at least it brings excitement and passion to people, then ultimately I don't think people are going to stick around.
I think part of it is because we as a church have lost sight of the fact that, particularly worship, I'll speak directly to worship because I think it's the easiest place to see it, but we as a church have lost sight of the fact that worship is not something that we are supposed to get. It's something we're supposed to give. Worship is not going to church and participating in an activity and receiving something from it. Worship is supposed to be us giving to God. And in our churches today, I agree with what you're saying. I see that going away, and it's becoming this, people are there to get from worship rather than to give in worship.
Oops.
So my question then is it seems to me that we're all pretty much in agreement that we are a very consumeristic style when it comes to our worship. So instead of just continuing to hack on the fact that we are that, what can we do to move away from that?
So I think we need to re-educate people of what it is.
I would definitely say that.
I don't know that Joel Osteen is destroying the church. I think that our desire for the hype as a church, period, destroys the church. Where we cease to remember that God's about the mundane every day, and we live for the high. and we've created a high. And we try to create the high, we live for the high. If we don't have the high, we think that we didn't touch the Holy
We
Spirit
failed.
and we didn't get to God. And we have done that without any prosperity gospel. We have created this need for the high. And the high is good. You know, you got to have the high once in a while or life gets too boring, I don't know. But we forgot that this God thing is about every day. It's
Let me ask you a question, just to piggyback on your ideas there, and feel free out there to jump in here. When was the last time you saw a little old lady wave her hanky and run around the sanctuary? Or have you ever seen it?
Every Sunday at my church. Every Sunday at my church, we have two in the back that do it literally every Sunday. That's their thing. They get up and they dance. And they
That's
do.
their
They've got
high.
she's got a big old shawl she waves. No hanky about it.
You know, in the record of the church, speaking on these highs, emotional highs, the Holiness Church had its highs.
glory bar.
You go back 50, 60, 80, 100 years, and you go back to Phineas Brzee when he had started his very first church, the Nazarene there in Los Angeles. Those people wanted to get up and shout and run around the sanctuary, and we kept a tradition going until probably by the mid to late 60s, things were beginning to settle down, so to speak. We were becoming more respectable. And
No, I did.
did you want to say something? But as we became more respectable, we had less and less of this hanky waving and running the aisles. And our camp meetings had that for a while because we were pulling in so many churches that still had remnants of that. There were a few people that weren't afraid to run around the campgrounds or run in the sanctuary under certain kind of dynamic preaching. But we were adrenaline driven.
Yeah.
We were. I mean, it was a different style. And I think you're right. I think we're trying to artificially pump it up. And if we can feel good, that's one thing. But are we getting anything when we feel
Well,
good?
and that was my other point of, you know, I appreciate the high, like I do, but then you have to, these people go and they work real jobs. You know, they don't live in the church. They work a real job. And the high doesn't follow them to the bank. The high doesn't follow them as a school teacher. And if you're not equipping your people to be incarnational every day where they're at, then their Christian walk is just about Sunday morning, and it's separate from what happens during the week because you've not connected it to the mundane everyday
You're not
life.
making it
Bethany.
relevant.
Relevant. All right, we're right back
And
to relevant.
that's more where I was trying to go with this, is that, you know, our worship services need to be a time where God becomes relevant in our lives. You know, why do we sing these songs? Why do we do the things that we do to worship? And how can we carry that out throughout the rest of the week? To where God is more than just a God of Wednesdays and Sundays, but a God of every day. And that's where I think the Church of the Nazarene has really kind of lost its appeal. And just not the Nazarene church, but all churches. We've allowed Sunday to become the high instead of equipping and making God relevant to people in today's society.
What do you think out there?
This is Kevin. I think what I'm hearing is something that I think was prevalent in the Greek culture as well, which was the idea of catharsis. You know, the idea of just having an emotional release as a part of dealing with life, and it was part of you know, their culture, and I think that's maybe what we're talking about, that when what we're calling the high is this idea of catharsis.
Do you think that's good or bad?
Well, like I've heard being said already, I think that you know, it definitely helps a person to feel good in the moment, but I wonder where the carryover is.
Well, what's the answer here? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to just say, I feel like we focus too much on the high of the week. You know, if we're going to really live it out day by day, I don't know if we
can't just focus just on the highs, because I was just thinking, I did a lot of ministry with college students, and one of the biggest things is, like, they were, going through these spiritual highs. They're like these Christian concerts, and then they'd come home from the Christian concerts, and they're all energized and hyped up, and then, a couple weeks later, they're right back doing what they did. Yeah, nothing changed. And we don't disciple our people enough to continue this on. Like, I feel like we have the mindset that this is how it's always going to be. But you don't see that in the scriptures.
Who's
I think
speaking?
so much of it becomes,
Okay, go ahead.
so much of the ministry such as Joel Osteen's becomes about that name it and claim it, that it's all about self. I want to feel good, and I want this, and I want that, and they forget the foundation of all that they are and who they are, and it just becomes about self. And in that essence, it does tend to hurt our churches, because that seeps into our churches, and it becomes more about self and how we feel and what we think than it does about God.
Okay. Other ideas?
Well, I know I had a class recently where we talked about the difference kind of between having that spiritual high and having a true, like, God spiritual experience. And, like, one of the things that was pointed out was when you have an experience, it's not just a high, it's your life has changed. And I think that's something that a lot of churches either aren't talking about enough or they're not focusing on, is that, you can go and have those moments of highs, but if you're not really being changed on the inside and letting it carry over, then there's not going to be an effect on society.
Very good. Yeah. Transformation, I think, is what we've been talking about here, and how our ministry can transform, and whether or not we're going to let the world affect us, merge into our lives, or we're going to, in a way, merge into the world where we transform the world. And certainly Christians were adapting and trying to come into this new world that they had been given legal right to later. We'll read about the persecutions first, but they were trying to take on the world, but trying to take it on too fast, and then suddenly got swallowed by it. You'll see that as you begin to read. Well, let's get out of the mystery religion. We're going to change screens.
I love how they just go on tangents. So I love the tangents.
We're moving on now down to the screen that is the Roman and Greek influence, lingua franca, and forward. There are several things that contributed to a world that was ready to receive Christianity. We talked about the influences of religion that the church was going to be facing, pagan and mystery cult religions. Rome was the state, and as the state, its religion controlled what was going on at that time. It was an old polytheism, but it was an impersonal state religion. Emperor worship had been installed to the point where people had to give allegiance to the emperor and view the emperor as God. They were faced with that. And if they could not declare their loyalty to the empire or to the emperor himself and burn a pinch of incense, then they were considered an outlaw. And they were persecuted accordingly, or their life was taken. And this was at the very point that Christians themselves could not do. Jesus alone was Lord for them. And they could not walk up to that altar and take a pinch of incense and just dab that little pinch on that altar and declare Caesar's Lord, receive a writ that guaranteed them freedom of religion for the rest of the year, walk away and go back to the Christian church and worship without persecution. They couldn't do that. And you're going to see that they suffered much because they would not do that. Julius Caesar, Nero, and other emperors declared themselves or were declared gods and deity. And while this was declared in Rome, there were only certain parts of the Roman Empire that strictly enforced this. And one area where the Christian church was heavily persecuted was in Asia Minor, the very scene of the 7 churches of the book of Revelation. This is where most serious persecutions took place, although there were other periodic persecutions that occurred, but it was here Christians suffered the most. So this is the world in which they're coming. But out of that world, what can they expect? What was it that made this, if we were to quote from Galatians 4:4, in the fullness of time, God brought forth His Son. What is it about that verse and world events that made this the right time for the entry of Christianity? Well, first of all, we talk about the influence of the Greeks. I've showed you a little bit about the Greek-Roman gods, but it was more than that. Philosophy, yes. But the Greek language, as you probably already studied or learned, was and became what we call the lingua franca. It was the trade language of the world. You spoke your native tongue, but then the language of commerce was Greek. And it wasn't classical Greek, it was Koine, the common Greek, the Greek of the common man. And this is the very language in which the New Testament was written, Koine Greek. A language that was very efficient in terms of communicating its ideas and thoughts in ways that we could understand exactly what the early culture was trying to understand and what it was trying to say. But along with that was the idea of philosophical comments coming from Plato and others. For example, I talked a little bit about Plato's idea of the forms, or the ideas that came from that world of patterns that they saw in the cave, his description. But it was the idea that there is a physical pattern or a physical idea that is beyond the idea that we understand now. What we see is one dimension, but there's another dimension beyond that. And thus we have a philosophical idea transporting the idea of the spiritual reality, that there's something besides the physical realm. The Epicureans, who looked for pleasure, were not just looking for pure pleasure, but they were looking for the supreme good. Ideas about what is the best, what is the supreme good. And of course, when you begin to study the ideas that Jesus himself was trying to teach, it was talking about the supreme good in his religious principles. The Stoics believed that there was virtue and reason was essential, a part of the divine man, and therefore reason a part of the virtue of life. And we think our way through things. We try to understand through reason. And of course, many of our theologies that we're developing came from the rational thought and the development of ideas. And Christianity is really a religion based upon what we would call doctrines and creeds, what we believe. That became very essential to Christian thought, as opposed to ideas that were floating around in other religions, such as Zoroastrianism, or in Buddhism that predates Christianity by 600 years. Here we're dealing with a different kind of thought pattern of the eternal internal divine rather than the external divine. Another ideas that were being brought about was that of the Jews. While we had Greek influences, we had Jewish influences. You can move on to your next slide. Well, let's back up. Let's go to the Roman influences. I'll deal with that first, and then I'll deal with Jewish. The Roman Empire, greatest empire of the world had known up to this point in time. Its borders were as far east as the Euphrates River, as far west as the Atlantic Ocean, as far north as Scotland and the Danube River, and as far south as the Sahara Desert. In fact, they encompassed the Mediterranean Sea, which the Romans called their lake. Not only were their borders broad and it encompassed all of what we would call today the Western world and the Near East, the empire was one that incorporated a host of tribes and nations and races and cultures and customs. Wide differences of practice and culture existed within the Roman Empire, which kept it together in spite of all these differences. In fact, at this point in time when Christ was born, the world was under what was known as the Roma, or the Pax Romana, the Pax Romana, Roman peace. A world that had become and made stable by the force of the Roman Empire. Though it ruled it with an iron fist and a hobnailed boot, nevertheless, it ruled a world that was at peace. This was a time of security and prosperity seldom known in the world of history.